A very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for tuning in this episode of UK-ASEAN Business Council Digital Expert Series on latest insights on ASEAN's higher education sector. I'm Veronica Lake with the UK-ASEAN Business Council based in London. We are delighted to have Aisling Comboy with us today, DIT's International Higher Education Specialist, also based in London. Husna Hashim, DIT's Head of Education for Asia Pacific, based in Kuala Lumpur, and Leighton Ernsberger, Director of Education at the British Council, based in Singapore. Today's discussion is led by UK-ASEAN Business Council's Director for ASEAN and Corporate Affairs, Alan Lai. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping points to highlight. Firstly, as you can see, you are all on mute, but this does not stop you engaging with our speakers. To ask a question or to make a statement, open the question box on your control panel. We will then direct your questions to our speakers during the Q&A session. Secondly, please note that the slides being used today, the recording of this very webinar, and all our speakers' contact details will be shared with you after the event. And lastly, please remember to reserve your virtual seat for the upcoming UK-ABC Digital Conversation Series, Southeast Asia Returns to Work on the 24th of June at 9 a.m. UK time, where we will be joined by a stellar panel from Southeast Asia. To register, just visit our website, www.ukabc.org.uk. And now, to guide you through a discussion on the latest insights on higher education in ASEAN, I'll hand over to our Director of Trade, chairing today's discussion. Alan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Veronica, for that very warm introduction, and good morning to everybody in the UK and good afternoon to all of our colleagues in ASEAN. We do have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, and as Veronica mentioned, spread out across the UK and Southeast Asia. And I'm based in Brunei, so we've certainly got the Commonwealth well and truly covered. Before we move on to our speakers, I'd like to provide a little bit of background and some insight on ASEAN and the UK-ASEAN Business Council. As we move into the first slide, you'll see the complete picture of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was established in 1967 with the aim of accelerating cultural development, economic growth, and social progress throughout the region. ASEAN countries are all very diverse, economically, culturally, and politically, and from the high-tech markets of Singapore to the increasingly open market but undeveloped of Myanmar. ASEAN has a very young, dynamic consumer market with a population of over 630 million, with an average age of just 26, and it has created a huge middle-class consumer base, where GDP per capita has seen 70% growth from 2007 to date, all of whom very hungry for education and a strong desire to improve their state. But COVID has certainly had an impact on the region, and Leighton has some fascinating statistics on whether people are thinking about delaying their studies and insight on education cancellation rates in the region, which we'll hear from later. But Southeast Asia certainly is where the growth is, and it's one of the first regions in the world that'll bounce back strongly. You'll hear from Husna on how the region has gone online and how the education system has responded to the challenges they have faced as we return to normal. I, for one, have certainly been enjoying a beautiful, quiet, undisturbed day today, as it is the first day back to school for my primary age children here in Brunei. And for much of the region, they're also getting back to school and business as usual as well. Before we begin, a quick note on the UK-ASEAN Business Council. The UK-ABC is the leading UK-based organisation promoting trade and investment between the UK and ASEAN's dynamic markets, not just to drive the pipeline of UK companies looking to do business with Southeast Asia, but also as a conduit for ASEAN companies looking for partnering here in the UK. We help companies of all sizes build new contacts, provide market insights, and raise the awareness of vast commercial opportunities. And we also bring ASEAN to the UK through a sustained calendar of events, and would encourage you as Veronica mentioned, to visit our website, where you'll see a series of programs and opportunities to learn more. But now let's get underway. We'll hear from Husna and Leighton a little bit later, and we'll certainly have time for Q&A. But first, I'd now like to invite Aisling to begin, where she will share with us DIT's policy developments, goals and long-term strategies for higher education in ASEAN. Aisling, over to you in London.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thanks, Veronica, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to join you all today. And first of all, from me, I hope you're all well. I know it's a very challenging time for lots of us, but I'm delighted to see that we have so many people actually on this webinar and from across the region. So my role in the Department for International Trade in London is I'm the Higher Education Specialist. And I don't cover a specific geography, but a lot of my work in the last few years has focused on ASEAN and higher education partnerships. I think it's a very exciting region, and I love to work in country and with colleagues globally, but I think I definitely have a soft spot for ASEAN, and it's really an important region for the UK and for our institutions. So today I'm going to look at some policy developments from the UK and some of our goals in terms of the relationship with ASEAN. And Veronica kindly shared with all the panelists today the list of attendees. So I thought it would be really worthwhile for our participants from across the globe just to give you a little bit of an update on UK universities at the moment in the current context, because I know we have participants from the UK and across ASEAN. So in terms of the messaging from the UK government, we want to reassure international students that our universities are open, that we offer world-class education, and that we offer support for international students that come to the UK. And despite the fact that we have the impact of COVID, our UK universities are open for business and recruiting students for next year. And there's been a huge amount of work done throughout the sector and lots of people on this call today to make sure that the student experience next year is very positive for students and that we can continue to deliver high quality education in the UK. And some of you might be aware that we will have a new graduate route whereby students who come to the UK will be able to work after graduation. So this is called the graduate route, and it will be launched in summer 2021. And although visa application centres may be closed, students can prepare now for their applications and to come to the UK for the next academic year. So yeah, we want to reassure you that the UK is a safe place for students to study and that UK universities are prioritising student safety and well-being. And I've been really heartened actually to see our institutions in the UK, how they have been flexible and adapted to what are challenging circumstances, but also in the partnerships between UK universities and ASEAN universities, how much cooperation there has been over this difficult period, but how we continue to work together. It's really a positive story, I think, for the future. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Yeah. So just to give you some context on our team in London and where I work, the Department for International Trade Education team promotes exports and investment in education. So across the spectrum, not just higher education, but vocational training, English language training, schools, EdTech. My role specifically is higher education, but we run across the gamut of different education levels. We work with a great range of colleagues across the UK. We have international trade advisors, and I know we have quite a few on this webinar today, which is great. And we have colleagues in embassies and high commissions like Husna, overseas, that we work closely day in, day out. So it's really nice. So I think for our institutions on the line, just remember that we're a resource for you, both in the UK, in London, in your region, and also when you travel overseas. So a good pointer, I think, from me is if you have any business trips or if you have some discussions ongoing with colleagues in a certain market or country, please always do reach out to us. for support in country, and in key regions in particular we have quite a large resource in terms of education colleagues with expertise in the region. So probably a lot of you are aware that we have our Trade Commissioner, Natalie Black, for Asia Pacific, and this covers Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Asia and Australasia. We work very closely with sector bodies, both in the UK and overseas, so particularly with Universities UK International, with the British Council, with Independent HE, with mission groups, with BUILA and others, as well as institutions directly. So please do avail of the support that's available. And some of you might be familiar with the Export Opportunities website, where we actually advertise current opportunities. So you can do a search, whether for higher education or for university or by region. And typically a lot of the opportunities on there are transnational education opportunities, so for joint dual degrees. So definitely sign up to the alerts and have a look at that. In terms of our activities, we do trade missions. We have a lot of government to government dialogues, which include education. And market access is something that is really important to the Department for International Trade. So please do get in touch if there's anything that you think that we could potentially help you with overseas, particularly in ASEAN in this context. Next slide, please, Veronica. Okay, great. So I briefly mentioned higher education. Well, a lot of you have probably seen that the government last year published a new international education strategy. And in this, we look at all different subsectors of education. But education from our perspective is really important, not only from a trade perspective, but also in terms of the soft power benefits to the UK. So the strategy was developed across governments and with the devolved administrations, and the Department for Education and DIT led the strategy development. And there's quite a focus on transnational education in ASEAN. And one of the key things that we want to look at are the barriers that you may face in the region and how we can help. The policy dialogues I mentioned and trade talks, I guess before I joined the Department for International Trade, I didn't necessarily realize that education, I didn't see it in the same sense as I might with other goods that are traded, but service sector is very important to the UK economy, and education is a really big, important export. But we've had trade talks and dialogues with countries like Vietnam, where education has certainly been at the top of the agenda in those discussions. So that's really important. And also it shows that it's not only important to us in the UK, but it's really important as a facet of our relationship with our ASEAN partners as well. So in the Department for International Trade, we want to be able to showcase the different models and variety of transnational education offered by UK institutions. And we support diversity, not only in terms of what countries we look to create partnerships with, but also in terms of academic subject areas and different models. I think increasingly in these times, people are looking to new ways of working and thinking maybe a bit differently. And in particular, I think diversity is very important. One of the things that I think is striking, I guess, is the impact of COVID. I'm sure will have a very big impact on education needs and training needs across the globe. So not only in the UK, but in ASEAN, what students will choose to study, what sectors will flourish and which ones may decline. So I think this will have a real impact in terms of what you think in terms of your offer, what you want to offer international students and what they might choose to study. And very recently, the UK has appointed an international education champion. Sir Steve Smith will join us from the University of Exeter. So this role will be pivotal in helping support our agenda, which is to further the interests of international education and UK providers, from English language schools to universities to edtech companies. So that's a little recap of the strategy. And then if we can move to the next slide. Thanks, Veronica. There are 3 specific action points in relation to transnational education. And the relationship with ASEAN is very strong in terms of transnational education, whether it's, I mentioned Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, there's a huge presence, and this is very relevant for ASEAN. So the action points are on us, things that we hope to achieve. The first one is that we want to work with the Department for Education and the British Council to identify more accurately the value of T&E to the UK economy. We have statistics at present, but we want to work on these to improve them and to improve the data that we have. The second action point in relation to transnational education is that we want to encourage dialogue to look at the export potential. And very often, recently, we've had some discussions where we can explain and showcase the best of UK higher education with our partners. And the third action point, again, it's for our departments to work across the board together, for the Department for International Trade, UK-ASEAN and the British Council to inform the sector of the opportunities. And we do this through exhibits, webinars and engagement sessions. Increasingly at the moment, as you can imagine, a lot of the usual trade work that we do has changed. But I'm delighted that we have lots of webinars and actual virtual trade missions underway, which actually shows that a lot of the cooperation can continue despite maybe limits to our mobility in terms of travel. So these action points are very relevant, I think, for the ASEAN context, and they give you an idea of the priorities and support that you can get from the UK government. So if we could move to the next slide, thank you. So just an overview in terms of why ASEAN, I think, is really important for the UK, for our institutions and for the government. The population is huge. Alan mentioned the demographics, and there's a growing middle class with huge demand for education and quality higher education, which the UK fulfills. In terms of priorities in ASEAN, openness and mobility within the region are very, very important, and harmonisation is on the agenda across the region, which I think facilitates our cooperation with different countries and the role that we play also. And I think very similar to the UK, a lot of our goals are similar in terms of diversification and collaboration that we want to see. So I think it's very heartening that many of the individual countries and ASEAN in general prioritises internationalisation within higher education and sees the importance. So I think working together, I would definitely recommend, if you work in an international office in the UK university or in a similar role, then have a look at the different strategies of the various governments for the countries in ASEAN, because they're very explicit in terms of the goals for higher education. If we could move to the next slide, please, that would be great. Thanks, Veronica. So the context I mentioned, rising middle class, demand for education and digital advances, all of these impact the sense of the partnership potential that we have from the UK. And the UK has recently put itself forward to become a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in ASEAN. And the UK already has a dedicated ambassador, so this is really important in terms of our representation in working together. You probably know Vietnam has the current chairmanship of the ASEAN, and internationalisation is very important, not only to institutions, but to the governments. The impact of the pandemic, it's really important. We'll hear from Husna about some of the impact and from Leighton. But in terms of our planning, I think I would encourage you all to look at short-term planning in cooperation with ASEAN, and also long-term, what we might want to achieve together. And access to digital education is very, very important in the context of recent changes to education. And there's been quite a lot highlighted about access and whether access is even, or there's certain marginalized groups that the move to digital education can be more difficult. So I would encourage you in your discussions with partners to think about the context and limitations, plus also the advances. And if we can move to the next slide, please. So just so that you're aware of the resources for institutions, I know we have some chartered bodies, universities, companies on the line, but we have an overseas market introduction service at DIT that you can get in touch with us if you would like some bespoke research or introductions made. We're happy to do that. We produce a quarterly newsletter from London. If you want to sign up, then let us know. We have the exporting opportunities, and currently we're looking to develop more virtual trade missions where we can still do those partnership discussions remotely while we can travel. Government to government trade talks I mentioned, and you have the support of not just me, but our colleagues in the region across the UK and in our embassies and high commissions. So please do keep in touch, and thank you very much.
Aisling, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Great overview of what's happening with the policy side of things and the DIT's great amount of support for UK organisations. We're now going to turn to Husna in Kuala Lumpur, and we'll hear more about what's happening in the region. For the latest insights on ASEAN's higher education sector, Husna.
Thank you, Alan. By means of introduction, my name is Husna and I am based in Kuala Lumpur. Just like Aisling, I don't have a specific country to focus, but I have been supported by colleagues in the region that represent 15 countries altogether. So for export purposes, for this sector, we are very much focused on the 10 ASEAN countries. Can you, yes, thank you. So in terms of international export for ASEAN, just to add to what Alan mentioned earlier about the complexity and the diversity in this region, I also like to add that the ASEAN region is very proud of being fragmented and also being flexible. So when we showcase the UK in this region, we're actually bring in five key themes. The English language, you can see higher educations, will promote skills, technical vocational educations, international schools, and of course, education technology. There are also a few cross-cutting themes that is becoming increasingly important for developed markets. They're looking at special education needs, early years, teacher trainings, and also some professional qualifications. What is important for us here in this region is the way we promote the UK is by using different subsectors. Can be attractive in different markets at different stages of development. So in terms of higher education in the ASEAN region, this is the most strongest and established subsectors. We have about 35% of higher education students enroll in private sectors, and then the 60% of the region higher education sectors are actually private sectors. So the UK are the market leaders for transnational educations. You can see Malaysia is one of the popular destinations for transnational educations. We are the home for 5 UK universities branch campuses. Yes, next slide, please, Veronica. So I thought it was showing you a SWOT analysis of the UK offer to the Asia Pacific region as a whole. I quite like to start with the Education is Great campaign. So the Education is Great campaign is one of the most established campaign globally for this region. We have the launched and developed the campaign 5 years ago, and since that we have received quite a lot of endorsements from the ministers in this region. We're also getting a lot, we have also generated a lot of enthusiasm and awareness among our suppliers and also our strategic partners. So we have a very strong coordinated team in the regions that shares over lesson learned. They know the subject well, and we've been working with colleagues in the British Council, in the HQ, and also DFE, UK-ASEAN as well. One of the things that you need to know about this region, English is our official business language, so it is quite easy to communicate and do business here. In terms of weaknesses, there is lack of funding in educations. Generally, if you looked at a bit of a background for the ASEAN region, they are quite diverse. We have the strong 5 ASEAN markets. We've got another set of countries like Cambodia, Laos, that are dependent a lot on aid fundings. So these aid fundings actually sometimes are making it commercial propositions difficult outside of higher education. Where programs are successful, sometimes visa can be difficult for educators to obtain to be teaching in this region. In terms of opportunity, the 8 dependencies, that's where we work closely with our colleagues in development banks, ADB, the Asian Development Banks, to get more UK providers working in this region. We are developing quite a lot of programs with Asian Development Bank. As we speak, there is a virtual showcase happening. Some markets in these regions offers opportunities back into ASEAN region. So there is a very strong multilateral relationship between these markets. So it is actually very important if you would like to work with Vietnam. Maybe it's also best to work with another ASEAN markets to make this relationship stronger. In terms of threat, there is the UK universities need to start thinking that the competition is not only within the other UK universities. There are strong and natural competitions exist in the region between the Japanese, the Australians, and New Zealanders. The China investment is pretty strong here in this region. They actually provide quite a lot of education infrastructure, offering scholarships which are very, very attractive to this region that may dwarf UK programs. Next, please. Next slide, please. Veronica, next slide, please. Thank you. So I thought I should just add to a bit of a sector overview from Iceland. I think first of all, let's just look at the COVID cases in Southeast Asia. The data that you see on the slide is based on early this month, so it's quite controllable, the number here, and it's only represent 4% of the global proportion rate. due to quite a lot of improvement in this region, a lot of the countries have started to be more flexible, to be in more flexible phase, where they have actually eased a lot of restrictions. More sectors are open. In terms of schools, a lot of the schools have switched to homeschooling using digital platform that are using Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom. We're seeing some using Facebooks, Zoom, a lot of other technology to ensure that there is an ongoing learning activities taking place. Good news is, beginning May, Vietnam is the first country to start with schools reopening at stages. Soon we will also have Malaysia, we will have a country like Laos, Brunei. I think Brunei has just started, a lot of countries have started with schools reopening. In terms of digital delivery, what we see that some are not prepared, but reasonably most schools are prepared for online teaching, both at academic and support staff. They have undergone a training. Some countries have actually launched a digital platform just before the crisis hit. So they are managing this very, very well. So in terms of programs in the universities, we are seeing that the program are running online to an end of this year, and then but still we found that universities facing difficulties in organizing skills or programs that education programs that are skills based. There are also, of course, when the crisis is hitting hard to the country's economy, we're seeing that a huge negative impacts on the budgets that is sometimes pressing the students to consider quitting their studies. Some governments have announced on deferrals on scholarships, so this will impact quite hard to the students. As then we see some of the private institutions that are depending on government grant, they had to close down for due to this. Some of the institutions are surviving, and there are offerings on fees reductions. In terms of level change in education calendar, there are some examples. Movement recruitment plans has been changed, has been pushed, and then just like other institutions, on top of the fees reduction, there's also a flexible payment on course fees being offered. Next slide, please. Specific challenges affecting UK education. Just a month ago, we have conducted a roundtable discussion with UK education providers to understand the issues that they are facing. These are some of the sharing that we've got from the discussion. Number one, we realized that a lot of the institutions have concerns in terms of visa and immigration procedures. This is directly from the decisions of closed borders that is not allowing, or stopping the teaching permits and student visas. There's also challenges in terms of quality standards and recognition of online delivery due to government in the regions not recognizing fully online degrees by overseas providers. But however, the governments here are temporarily lifting the ban, and they are keen to endorse blended delivery. We see reduced short-term enrollment losses. Back to my point earlier in terms of government's negative impact on economy. A lot of the governments has now make a cutback on the budgets, and there is some reprioritizations. There's also a lot of questions by our partners in terms of student employment outcomes. If at this point of time, if they are an overseas students graduate. Very quickly, next slide, I'll touch on our initial comparative studies.
Can I suggest, if you wouldn't mind, just going to the case study and just very quickly covering the case study, and then perhaps we can cover anything else in the Q&A section. And then we'll also have the presentation available for everyone to read afterwards. But if there's perhaps any pressing points you'd like to make in the slides you still have left, we could do that in the Q&A, but perhaps just wrap up very quickly with the case study, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, I think it's just the second slide after Veronica, after this, right? So Lancaster and Summer University is one of the strongest partnerships that we have in this region. What I like to say is, this partnership has started with just teaching, and then they have then evolved into research collaborations and other engagements activities. Sunway is a very strong partner that's just not focusing education. They have other businesses which the university is taking advantage of. Yes. Next slide. What I want to say about this region, there is a lot of activities going on. In the light of the crisis, we're running quite a lot of digital activities. There will gradually we will move into a physical meetings. You will see in January and March, there's quite a lot of programs lining up. I'd also like to say at the end of my notes, there's a lot of opportunities still exist in this region. Although some are still on hold, but there is still a lot of threats that has turned into opportunities. To know more about this region, we have our marketing collateral case studies in the UK-ABC microsite. So I encourage you to download a copy of this marketing collateral from this website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Husna, and sorry to rush you along. We'll cover more in the Q&A. We've got questions coming through in the question box. Please do send your questions across. But first, we'd like to turn to Leighton from the British Council in Singapore. Leighton, you've got some fascinating data working hard on the impact of COVID in the region. Over to you, and then we'll take a little bit of time for some questions together with Aisling and Husna. We can't hear you, Leighton. Can you?
I can't. There you go. Can you hear me now?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself for some reason. But anyways, I'm back with you. So yes, good to be chatting with you all now. So yeah, the British Council, you'll be aware, is a global organization. We have 7 offices in ASEAN. The 3 countries where we don't have a presence is Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei. Otherwise, we have education specialists who I work with in the other 7 ASEAN countries. So I wanted to take you through a little bit about student numbers, about inbound students who study in the UK, but also comparing that to TNE, and then a little bit of reflection on the student sentiment survey that we recently completed for sort of wider East Asia, and then finally just to wrap up a little bit about the Study UK campaign and just a bit more information for you about the work that we're up to, and hopefully how you can get involved. So this is really to look at what we would say the sort of country competitor analysis. What we do regularly, it is largely dependent on what data countries publish, but we also tend to look at particularly benchmarking the UK against the other English language speaking destinations. So globally, that means we, as an organization, we look at our numbers compared to Australia, Canada, US, and ourselves. Increasingly, you could say, as courses start to be taught in English in Europe, particularly Germany and France, and even Holland, there's a degree of competition on that same basis happening there. So it is an ever-changing market. But just looking at that particular mix, you can see where we sit, largely speaking, is we're sort of 3rd across ASEAN. It does vary significantly by country. In Singapore, we are still just ahead, and in Vietnam, the US does have a significant presence. So, ASEAN, while it is a group of 10 states, it is very different by country, what the actual mobility reality looks like. And the other thing that I think is interesting to note within these statistics is that the UK market share might be 24%, but that is also a function of the fact that this is participation data. This isn't new starts. So because courses are generally longer, both undergraduate and postgraduate in the US and Canada, the new starts figure might be slightly different. But in terms of participation in 1819, they do have slightly larger numbers than you might have expected. Overall, students from ASEAN make up about 10% of non-EU students in the UK, roughly 7% overall. If you move to the next slide, please. So if we look specifically at ASEAN HE students going to the UK, there is a little bit of a tailing off of numbers. There's quite a bit of decline coming from Malaysian students, where we obviously have a very strong in-country TNE offer now. And there's also sort of demographic and improving quality of local higher education offer, particularly in a country like Singapore, where you'll see an increasing number of sort of aging population, but also students being able to sort of stay home and study in equally very highly ranked universities here. But from that perspective, ASEAN remains a very important region to the UK. And if we go to the next slide, which shows you TNE slides, the 30-odd thousand numbers that you get in terms of students studying in the UK, we have a significant proportion of students studying on UK transnational education programs. So in Singapore alone, you have 41,500, and a significant proportion in Malaysia. Both countries have pretty solid in-country offers. You have the branch campuses in Malaysia. You have a significant number of franchise and joint degree partnerships in Singapore. But this is also a function, and I think it's worth reflecting on one of the threats that I saw in Husna's slides, that there is a lot of concern around the sort of the threat of the German skills sectors, but there is always a significant strength in the UK skills sector as well, particularly around professional qualifications. A significant proportion of the enrollments that we have on our UK transnational education is on sort of accountancy, management professional qualifications and other chartered institutes. It is also worth noting that this data is drawn largely from HEIs. So, professional qualifications don't all go through sort of the higher education route. So you can imagine that actually the overall total of students taking UK qualifications and UK transnational is probably even stronger than this. If we go to the next slide, please. We're just going to move into the market sentiment survey. There is a short video available on our website that you can also go into to get a bit more detail from it. For this particular seminar, we're going to focus on the 5 countries in ASEAN that we included in the survey. There is quite a significant tail off if you go beyond Indonesia and Vietnam, which have roughly 3,500 odd students going to the UK. Next would be, say, Brunei and Philippines with just under 1,000. So we focused on the 5 biggest markets for the UK. And we asked them really about what their plans are and what their sentiment is about their upcoming studies. So we also focus quite a lot on students intending to study overseas, and particularly in the UK. If we go to the next slide, please. The key question that we asked them about was how likely they are to delay or cancel their plans to study abroad. And you'll see that, that sort of the already cancelled, very likely to cancel, you would say, is our baseline, and across the region that was around 12% of students. On the other end, you actually see some fairly positive statistics around not at all likely, somewhat unlikely. So we would take them as fairly strong sentiments to continue study with the UK. Something you'll notice in this graph is that Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore are particularly strong and are somewhat likely and not at all likely. And that's because out of the 10 countries that we reviewed, they all have significantly higher undergraduate numbers than they do postgraduate numbers. And of course, if you're a continuing student, then your likelihood of wishing to continue your studies is that much higher. You would see that Indonesia is very close to Taiwan as far as having some nerves about studying overseas. It is around 3,500, so it's still quite a significant number for the UK in that particular space. If we go to the next slide, we were touching sort of upon what the likelihood is by type, of course, but this is also about whether or not we sort of picked up in the background, also speaking to agents about, whether the decision to cancel or defer would be influenced by having a single term potentially delivered, blended, and at a distance. There was a greater willingness to take a blended course approach for those countries where there was a large number of undergraduate students. There was a lot more skepticism to do one term through a blended or a distance learning approach for postgraduate students, considering with the 1-year master's on a lot of programs, that is a significant proportion of the time compared to undergraduate students. So it did matter what level of study and therefore which market we were particularly looking at. But it's also worth noting that there is a strong determination amongst this cohort of students to get that international experience, to study overseas, and to get that that exposure. So in a way, these students are still quite distinct in character to students who tend to take up transnational education opportunities. In fact, there may even be a read-through, because I'm sure quite a significant number of the transnational students who come back to do professional qualifications would have had a positive experience in the UK. A really good bit of news that I saw come through just this morning, though I'm not entirely sure when it was released, but I saw the UUKI survey of UK institutions, and there is a big commitment by the UK sector to offer sort of in-person teaching. There may be a situation, as in Cambridge, where there are sort of going to be lectures online, but there would still be seminars in person. And I think it's really important that that the emerging clarity that is coming out because of how much influence the ability to get that in-person experience, both social and academic, is really important to the students who are considering whether to delay or cancel their overseas studies. If we go to the next slide. So in addition to getting their, the academic and the social experience that they want, we also asked what are their other major concerns, and these were the ones that really came through. So it isn't so much about financing, but it is very much to do with health and well-being. Obviously, health and well-being is quite a lot to do right now with sort of perceptions of how the UK is coping with the particular crisis. So a really important sort of hygiene part that I'm sure UK universities are well aware of by now, but the wearing of masks is obviously extremely normal and accepted here in ASEAN and across East Asia, and much less so to some extent in the UK, though I know that is changing. But those messages about health and well-being are really important, and also clarity around what the quarantine arrangements might actually look like for students. I mean, that isn't necessarily a negative for students because they're going to be there for a long time. It's about clarity, really. Personal safety is important too, because there have been very high profile reports and concerning reports about incidents that happened early on in the crisis. So that's another concern when you're considering your messaging to prospective students. If you go on to our next slide, please. So finally, the key takeaway that we have from this really is about how much there is to play for in this very short window. And while I do think that there will be some benefit from that sort of technology and that TNE offer, there is a significant percentage who we also want to continue to study and experience life in the UK. So there's around 47% from specifically ASEAN within that study who are in the persuadable category as we see it. And that overall, if we look at direct expenditure, it does come up to around 300 million. So there is a lot for us to consider. If we go on to the next slide, I'll just wrap it up as I see my colleagues come on video alongside me. I just wanted to let you be aware of the Study UK campaign. This is a joint campaign between the British Council and the GREAT campaign, and it's a student-facing campaign for students and influencers. It's been running for quite a while now, and we do boosted events in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, where we do a lot of careers fairs. But we also want to make sure that we have that impact across East Asia and 5 key priority markets in ASEAN. So you'll see a little bit about the sort of campaign overview, and it's just reinforcing existing messages that we have coming out of the UK, that the UK is open, which I'm very pleased about the announcements from UUKI today, that it's safe, which we can all play our part in, and it's trustworthy, because I think the very strong focus on quality assurance will always act in the UK's favour. And on the next slide, I'll sort of wrap it up and just say that, obviously you can reach out to the British Council through our International Education Services role. Do feel free to email me if you want to follow up on any of those particular points. And I hope that my son feels a little bit better soon, just in case you can hear him crying in the background. Thank you all very much for your time.
Leighton, thank you. That was fantastic. I've got questions are flooding in, and we've got about 6-7 minutes to go. A lot of people are very impressed with the statistics that you've been reeling off. Quick question. This is an excellent piece of research when it comes to sentiment. Do you have any indication what will motivate international students to get on a plane and travel halfway around the world for their studies? You talked about a little bit about Open UK, but how can we, I mean, that's very much on paper. How do we motivate people to give them that assurance? And perhaps, Aisling, you talked a bit about this earlier, if you could come in after Leighton as well.
So I think the primary concern that we picked up was around, getting that face-to-face experience, that overseas exposure. That's really important. So that's why I was stressing a lot on the sort of UUKI announcement on behalf of UK universities. It is also about things returning to normal. So when visa services open again, people will feel like, it's real and it's possible. So there are still some sort of visa opportunities which are not available, but they will be shortly. And I think it is really just about the, that sort of open, welcoming message. But there probably will be a dip. I think we can't deny that. That 12% is still something for us to bear in mind. So I think it is just about, keeping those positive, welcoming messages coming through. And as we see life returning to normal, and UCAS will hopefully be publishing their data soon, and that will give us another indication of how much we can stay, sort of feel that there is good continuity. But I feel some of the recent announcements have played a significant role in that sort of open, welcoming sort of role that I think will be a big factor.
Thank you, Leighton. Aisling, could you come in here and just what assurances are UK universities providing? You talked a little bit about it earlier, but how do you? It's a lot of money to invest. It's a long way round to the other side of the world to send your your beloved child. How do you reassure parents and the students themselves?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a key point. And I guess from government point of view, I'd like to reassure people on the webinar that there's a huge amount of close working between the Department for Education, the Department for International Trade, British Council, WILA, UK-ASEAN and others on this around the messaging that we send out from government. So our universities minister recently did a communication with all international students, and we've been in touch with all our embassies and high commissions overseas to make sure that that open and welcoming and safe messaging is disseminated throughout all the government and British Council resources that we have. But from an institutional level, I think in terms of how do we motivate students, it's difficult times, and I think I would, if I was in an institution, I would try as much as possible to use all of your assets in the region, whether that's your agent network or your alumni, and it's challenging to do it when it's remotely, but I think there's a huge still value in UK education and recognition that it's high quality. So I think probably the consistent messaging is really important, and especially with the limitations on travel and so on, I think making sure that we communicate as much as possible. So I think a lot of the webinars and information sessions focused on students and virtual fairs are really, really important. And I know it's challenging for everybody, but I would say on behalf of our government departments working on this, we're working very, very closely with sector representative bodies to make sure that we as government get the messaging right too.
And I suppose also, Aisling, just to make sure the ASEAN embassies and missions in London are aware of what the universities and institutions are doing, just to give them the assurance, because they're representing the students' welfare, and if they know that the universities and organisations are proactive, that will give a high degree of comfort as well.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And we've engaged quite a bit, and I know our minister has as well, with events where we've had representatives from embassies in London, which is really great. And I've had a few attaches in touch with me as well, which is really, really key, because they're an important source of information for parents as well, and for students and institutions to reassure them.
Moving on to a different topic, but also very important. We talked a lot about blended learning and the changing nature of education in Southeast Asia. Question here from John. Do all schools, colleges and universities in ASEAN have their own learning platforms, or is there a demand for such? Husna, what are universities using? What are the platforms? And Leighton, perhaps if you could come in as well after that.
Thank you for the questions. Well, the universities here are using multi-delivery. They have most of the university has their own LMS, the virtual learning environment. And like I said earlier, most universities has quite a stable infrastructure, but there's quite a lot of limitations in delivering skills educations programs or lab work using digital. But at the moment, we're seeing a lot of the universities carrying on their online delivery. And in fact, the announcements that we've got recently, this will continue till the end of the year. There is also a questions on inclusive educations. What about students in vulnerable conditions? Well, different country will have different measures completely. Some of them have what we call it a student's pack, where they will get teaching materials to be sent at home by the schools or the universities. There are TV channels and radio channels to support this as well.
Thank you very much, Husna. We've got about 1 minute left. Leighton, if you could come in on that as well and just give your sort of concluding thoughts. We've got a lot of questions on China as well, both Chinese Chinese students in the Chinese market as well. So perhaps, although we are Southeast Asia, what are the opportunities for Chinese students perhaps studying in Southeast Asia with universities and organizations that from the UK that are in Southeast Asia? Leighton, if you could reflect on that as well in your
I see, yeah, that's an interesting angle. I mean, in terms of who the international students are who are studying, particularly in Malaysia and Singapore, there are a significant proportion of them who are actually Chinese students. And I have to admit, from the HEIs data, I don't know that I could probably see that, but the destination countries that we know is most common is sort of where we already have the hotspots for in-country offers. So I would say Malaysia and Singapore are top. My guess, though, is in most of our market sentiment surveys, we were largely picking up from, if you like, Chinese students, that their choice was really between the different English language speaking countries. We didn't get a lot of, we would go to an sort of UK offer on a transnational basis. There wasn't that sort of thought process that we picked up from the student sentiment survey amongst the Chinese students. It was largely, where will they get that overseas cultural experience? And obviously, most of who we reached out to were first preference UK. So I think from that perspective, it is more of a where will they get the experience they were hoping to get by going to the UK, and that's where probably those students who intended the UK are looking maybe then at other countries. But obviously, Australia right now has got into a bit of hot water with the Chinese government and the official announcement that they've been giving to Chinese students. So it's impossible to tell what influence that might have on the thinking of Chinese students, as that's only happened in the last week or so. But yeah, it's an interesting time.
Thank you very much, Leighton. Husna, and could you provide some concluding thoughts, and then I'll hand over to Aisling for final remarks.
Sure. What I would like to highlight, international collaborations in this region is still very relevant. We see there's a lot of interest from not just governments. There's also corporates are also investing on continuous professional development at this time to upskill their workforce. So with the multilateral organization, we see that they want to engage agencies to deliver online trainings, especially on healthcare. So they are very, very diverse needs in this region. So it's just a matter of us being very, very innovative to offer them a very strategic proposition.
Thank you. Aisling, 30 seconds.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I would just like to say thanks to everybody for all of your hard work in what is a very challenging time. I'm optimistic, though. We have a lot of challenges, but I think with that, there's a lot of opportunities for us to work together and solidify our partnerships in ASEAN. Students really matter to all of us, and we really want to welcome international students to the UK next year, and also ensure our partnerships will grow. And I think working together through the challenges will make the relationships stronger in the long term. So please do keep in touch with your partners, and the communication lines are really important. Thank you.
And with that, thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. I do apologize we weren't able to get through the huge number of questions that came through. We'll try and see whether our panel can answer them via email and send them out together with the link. Some of you are asking for the link for our microsite and, of course, more information. There's some contact details on the screen if you'd like to reach out to any of us specifically. And also do join us next week. We have a fantastic discussion on Southeast Asia returning to work. What does the new normal look like? And we've got a fantastic panel of speakers from Southeast Asia and the UK as well. And with that, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the not too distant future. Thank you and goodbye.